On what should be the happiest day of his father's life, Liam makes a decision that changes everything. As he watches his father about to marry Emily, a woman who hides dark secrets, he decides to reveal a shocking truth that no one could ever imagine. Liam was there, standing next to his father at the small altar of the church. The surroundings seemed perfect for any other, with the afternoon sun streaming in through the tinted glass windows, illuminating the place in warm shades of red, yellow, and blue. The guests whispered excitedly, eager to see the groom and his future wife. But for Liam, the whole thing was like a scene from a fake movie. He couldn't move. The ring pillow trembled in his hands, his little fingers gripping the fabric hard enough to whiten his knuckles. He was petrified. His eyes never left his father, David, who seemed oblivious to everything. With the most sincere smile Liam had seen on him in the last 2 years, David was adjusting his suit, a little clumsily, his hands shaking nervously. "You look great, Dad," Liam murmured, although he felt nothing but a knot tightening in his throat. David looked at his son, laughed softly, and winked. "You too, champ. The best ring bearer a father could have." On any other day, those words would make Liam smile. But today, everything seemed out of place, wrong, as if something very bad was about to happen. Time dragged on. Each second seemed longer than the last, as if the universe was delaying events, creating an overwhelming anxiety inside him. And then finally, the first chords of the traditional wedding sound began. Everyone stood up at the same time, the sound of chairs dragging echoing through the sacred space. The guests' heads turned in unison toward the church's double doors. Liam kept his eyes fixed on his father, as if hoping that he would somehow realize that something wasn't right. But nothing. David just looked towards the entrance, waiting for Emily, the smile on his face full of admiration. The doors opened, and there she was. Emily, engaged to be married. She was exactly as everyone expected. Perfect, gliding down the aisle in a sparkling white dress, her perfectly arranged blonde hair falling over her shoulders. She looked calm, happy, like a woman who was finally about to experience the great love of her life. But Liam knew. Deep down, he knew there was something wrong. She wasn't the person his father thought she was, and that was eating him up inside in a mixture of helplessness and fear that made his head throb. Next to him, David leaned over slightly, without taking his eyes off Emily, and murmured, "She's wonderful, isn't she, son?" Liam barely managed to nod. His father didn't see what he saw. For David, everything was happiness, but for Liam, the air around him seemed heavy, suffocating. As the ceremony began, the officiant's words echoed in Liam's mind like a distant hum. His voice barely passed his ears, as if each sentence was being swallowed up by the deafening silence of his own panic. He was there, in the middle of it all, but at the same time, he wasn't. It was like watching something he couldn't stop. Liam's mind began to wander, and suddenly he was back to the day his father brought Emily home for the first time. He remembered David's enthusiasm, the way he laughed and joked all the way home from school. "I've got someone special I want you to meet," he had said with a twinkle in his eye that Liam hadn't seen since his mother died. But the boy had felt something strange from that first moment. Emily was there, standing on the porch smiling, but her smile seemed empty. It was beautiful, but there was something Liam couldn't explain. The way she looked at him that day, as if she was evaluating his every move. When she bent down to meet Liam, her voice sounded warm, almost too sweet. "It's nice to meet you, Liam. Your father talks about you all the time." And with those words, everything seemed easier. Maybe, just maybe, things weren't so bad. But the feeling of strangeness never went away. And as time passed, Liam began to realize the truth. He began to notice the subtle changes. Emily was different when her father wasn't around. She was cold, cutting, and every time David left the house, it was as if a mask fell off her face. The smiles disappeared. The words were sharp, almost cruel. And now there he was, at his father's wedding to this woman, the woman who had turned his life into a silent hell. Every time she ignored him, or made a comment that seemed innocent but hurt deeply, Liam felt more alone. And no one saw. No one noticed. David was blind, too happy to realize that his son was sinking into fear and mistrust. The ceremony continued, but for Liam, everything was already falling apart. His hands were sweating, the pillow was slipping from his fingers. Her face, the woman everyone looked at as if she were the purest and most perfect person, was a fake to him. And he knew somehow that if he didn't do something, everything would fall apart. But what could an 8-year-old boy do? Everything started to fall apart in Liam's head the moment Emily walked into that house. It didn't happen all at once, you know. At first, he even thought that maybe he was being a bit dramatic. She seemed nice, smiling, always wearing those pretty clothes that made his father go crazy just looking at them. And for a while, Liam tried to believe that everything was going to be all right. His father was happy for the first time since his mother had passed away. He deserved that, right? But there was something that didn't add up. When his father was around, Emily seemed like the best person in the world. You know, she'd ask him about his homework, give him a compliment here and there, touch his hair as if they were friends. But as soon as David left the room, it was as if someone turned off the light in her eyes. She ignored him. Or worse, she talked to him like that, like someone who's putting up with you out of sheer obligation. There was one night that Liam couldn't forget. His father was working late, and Emily was in charge of looking after him. He got excited, thought that maybe they could watch a movie together, maybe talk. So off he went to try and strike up a conversation, you know. The school had started teaching about the solar system, and he excitedly asked her if she liked planets. But the answer came as a shock. "I'm busy, Liam. Eat up and go to sleep," she said, without even looking up from her cell phone. That hurt. It hurt more than he thought it could. Suddenly, the kitchen was huge and silent, as if he had been swept out of any importance at that moment. He tried to ignore it. He did as she told him, ate in silence, went to his room and lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering what he had done wrong. Why was she like that? What did she have against him? And why, no matter how hard he tried, couldn't he tell his father? It was as if every time he rehearsed the words, something choked him. But it wasn't just once. Over time, there were so many that he didn't even know which was worse. The days when his father was at home and Emily pretended to be his friend, or the nights when they were alone and she changed. The smile disappeared, and in its place came those comments that made him feel small. "You're so clumsy, Liam. Your father works a miracle putting up with you." And his father. His father was so blind that it was as if he couldn't see anything but the false glow that Emily exuded. For David, she was the solution to everything, the future I always wanted. And that trapped Liam even more. He saw his father smiling, dancing around the house, as if life had taken on new colors. And how could he spoil that? Time went by, and he closed himself off more and more. Those jokes that used to make his father laugh, gone. The conversations at the dinner table, they became rare. When he was alone with Emily, the house seemed to shrink. And what about her? She was always too busy, too irritated, ready to cut off any attempt at interaction he made. But then there was that day that changed everything. It was a Saturday afternoon. Her father had gone out to sort things out, and Emily was strangely nervous. She was pacing back and forth in the living room, with her phone pressed to her ear. Liam was on the sofa trying to pretend he was watching TV, but every word she said hit him like a punch in the gut. She was talking to someone called Mark, and it wasn't friendly at all. She was angry, whispering as if she didn't want anyone to hear, but Liam was there, listening to every word. "We have to wait until the wedding," she said, in that cold voice that now made his blood run cold. "Then we'll do what we agreed. Everything will look like an accident, and then we'll get the money." Money? Accident? Liam felt the floor disappear. His hands began to shake, his heart raced. He wanted to run, he wanted to scream, but his body wouldn't respond. He stood there trying to understand what he had just heard. It was as if his whole world had turned upside down, and everything he knew about Emily, about his father, about this new life, was falling apart. "This kid is the problem," she continued, and Liam could hardly breathe. "He's too clever, but I'll take care of it. David would never believe him. Everything's under control." When she hung up the phone, silence fell over the house, and Liam stood there paralyzed. What could he do? What could an 8-year-old do against an adult who had planned everything? The days following that phone call were a torment for Liam. He could hardly sleep, fear running like an electric current through his body every time he closed his eyes. Emily was up to something terrible, and he knew his father was in danger. But what could a boy like him do? He tried to think of all the possibilities, but everything seemed small, useless, compared to what Emily was capable of. And the closer the wedding got, the worse it got. Emily was different. Now she didn't even bother to hide her coldness. She ignored him completely or looked at him out of the corner of her eye, as if she was always one step ahead, knowing that he knew, and daring him to try and do something. Liam felt suffocated inside the house, as if every wall was slowly closing in on him, leaving him with no way out. He had tried to tell his father once, but had failed miserably. He remembered that day well. His father was in his office, going through some papers, smiling as always. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something," Liam had started, his heart pounding in his chest. David stopped what he was doing and looked at him with a calm but tired smile. "Sure, son, talk." The words caught in his throat. He wanted to tell him so much, but how could he explain something like this? "Emily, I don't think she likes me. She's different when you're not around." That's all he managed to say in a shaky voice. David frowned, surprised. "Oh, son, that's just because it's a big change. She loves you. She's just adjusting to this new phase. Give her a chance, okay? It'll be all right." Liam wanted to shout that no, it wasn't okay, but his father couldn't see. He didn't want to see. How do you tell someone that the person they love is planning to destroy them? His father was blind, enchanted, and Liam stood there watching his father go back to his papers, laughing at something Emily had said earlier. He left there with a weight on his chest that seemed to double every day. And now the wedding was only a few days away. Every smile his father gave him, every time Emily kissed him on the forehead, Liam felt even more lost. It was like living a lie, knowing that everything was going to fall apart, and that he was alone in the midst of this chaos. The pressure only increased. One afternoon, things came to a head. David went off to sort out something with the wedding, leaving Liam and Emily alone at home. He was in the living room, trying to keep his distance, pretending to be immersed in some cartoon on TV, when he heard footsteps behind him. His whole body went rigid. She stopped beside the sofa, and Liam could feel her eyes on him. "What did you hear that night?" Her voice was sharp as a knife. He didn't answer, fear paralyzing him. She moved a little closer, her tone lower, more threatening. "Do you think you're going to ruin everything? Because you won't. No one will believe you. Your father, he loves me, not you. If you try anything, you'll only make things worse for him." The air seemed to run out, and Liam wanted to disappear. He knew she was right. How could a boy fight it? It was her word against his, and David was completely caught up in the web Emily had woven. He barely looked at her, afraid that her gaze might give him away. "You'll be quiet, won't you?" She smiled, that smile he hated, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Because if you don't, it'll be much worse for both of you." She walked away as if nothing had happened, going back to getting ready for some meeting, while Liam stayed there curled up on the sofa, his stomach churning. She had him in her hands. Anything she did could destroy not only his life, but her father's, and that responsibility was too enormous to bear. From that moment on, anxiety consumed him. He avoided Emily at all costs, but he couldn't help watching her movements. Every time she left the room to answer the phone, or typed frantically on her cell phone, he knew that something else was being planned. She was in constant contact with someone, and he was betting that it was Mark. Her name flashed across the screen in messages, always exchanged in a hurry when David wasn't around. But Liam couldn't just watch and do nothing. He knew that if he didn't take action, something terrible would happen. The clock was ticking, and the wedding was approaching all too quickly. As the wedding drew closer, the weight on Liam's back only increased. Emily seemed more agitated, more anxious with each passing day. He watched her in silence, trying to decipher her movements, hoping for a loophole, something he could use to stop what was about to happen. He knew he couldn't trust anyone. His father was blinded by love, and who else would believe an 8-year-old boy? It was on one of these nights during one of Emily's long absences that Liam found his opportunity. David was in the garage fixing something, as he always did to relax. Liam stayed at home, keeping a watchful eye. He knew he had to act quickly. He took what courage he had left and went to Emily's office. Her laptop was there, on the desk, closed as usual. He knew he couldn't waste any time, so with trembling hands he opened the laptop and started looking through it. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but his instincts guided him. And then he found it, a folder labeled David's Life Insurance. Liam's heart raced. He clicked, and what he saw there made his world go round. Life insurance documents with his father's name on them, detailing millions of dollars. There were clauses about accidental death, and just below that, the amount that would be paid out. It was millions. Emily would be rich if anything happened to her father. There was the proof. She was planning to take his life so that she could keep all the money. Liam felt his stomach turn. Sweat ran down his hands as he continued to fiddle with his laptop, finding other folders, other evidence. There were photos of Emily with another man. He had to be Mark, her partner in the plan. They were in various poses, laughing, hugging. There was no doubt about it. Not only was she deceiving her father, but she was also plotting something much bigger. Panic grew inside him. What would he do now? How would he tell his father? He closed the laptop carefully, trying to control the despair that threatened to explode. He had no time. The wedding was only a few days away. He had to act, but how? Worst of all, no one would believe him. He knew that. He'd tried it before, and his father had laughed, running his hand over his head, as if he was just imagining things. What if he tried again, only now, with something so serious? With an assassination plot? David might even get angry with him, thinking he was making up stories to drive Emily away. But Liam had no choice. He had to take a risk. He couldn't let anything happen to his father. He knew that, as much as Emily was always one step ahead, he had the truth. And the truth was that if he didn't do something, in a few days his father would be dead. The days passed like a blur. Liam cringed more and more inside himself, trying to think of a solution. He felt time slipping through his fingers, like sand in an hourglass that was about to run out. And more, he felt Emily's gaze on him, as if she knew he was about to try something. She smiled, that cold, calculating smile, which only increased the dread that gripped the boy. The wedding day arrived. Liam looked at his father with sadness and despair, his heart as heavy as a stone. David was overjoyed, so happy that he could hardly contain himself. He looked at Emily with shining eyes, unaware of the trap that awaited him. And as the guests gathered in the church, as Emily prepared to deliver the final blow, Liam knew he had to make a decision. It was now or never. The wedding music began to play, and the church rose to its feet. All eyes were on Emily, who was gliding down the aisle with that smile of pure falsehood on her face. But Liam couldn't look away from his father. This was a trap, and David was walking straight into it. The officiant's words began to echo through the church, but Liam heard nothing. He was in a whirlwind of thoughts, feeling the cold sweat on his back, his trembling hands clutching the pillow with the rings. And then that moment came, the words that would seal everything. If anyone here knows anything that will stop this wedding, speak now or forever hold your peace. Silence fell in the church. All eyes were fixed on the altar. Emily glanced quickly at the guests, her smile widening, knowing that she was about to get what she wanted. But then Liam's voice, thin and trembling, broke the silence. Wait! The word echoed through the church like thunder, making everyone turn around at once. The silence that took over the church was palpable. All eyes turned to Liam, who was shaking from head to toe, but remained standing. His heart felt like it wanted to explode in his chest. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. There was no more hiding. This was bigger than any fear he might have had. David looked at his son, confused, worried. Emily's face immediately hardened, as if she had been slapped, but she quickly disguised it, pressing her lips together and casting a look of false sympathy at the guests, as if to control the situation before it got out of her hands. But Liam knew what he had to do. It was now or never. You can't marry her, Dad. You can't, he finally said. his voice breaking but strong enough to be heard by everyone. Those words, laden with a truth he had kept hidden for months, cut through the air like a knife. The look of surprise on David's face was clear, but Emily's? That wasn't surprise. It was fury. For a second, her face blurred, and he could see the real Emily, the person who was hiding behind that mask. David took a step forward, trying to understand what was happening. Liam, son, what are you talking about? He sounded worried, almost as if he thought his son was just nervous. But Liam knew he needed to say everything. He needed to be heard before it was too late. His voice came out hurried, full of fear and desperation. She's lying to you, Dad. She's plotting something against you. I heard her talking to a man, Mark. They're planning to hurt you to get your money. There's a life insurance policy. I saw it on her computer. They're going to kill you. The words seemed too heavy for such a small boy, but they came out with a force he didn't even know he had. And when he heard them, the whole church was filled with an uneasy murmur. People began to whisper, confused, looking from David to Emily, not understanding what was happening. David stood still, pale as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He looked at Emily for an explanation. Emily, what is he saying? His voice trembled. What had once been a man full of confidence and happiness now sounded like a father, frightened and unable to understand what was going on. Emily, for her part, was quick. Her smile was so fake that Liam felt a chill run down his spine. David, please, you can't believe this. He's just a child. He's nervous about the wedding. That's natural. He's just scared of all the changes. She turned to the guests, her voice taking on an almost motherly tone, almost as if she were apologizing. I never wanted this. I never wanted him to feel this way. He's confused. It's a lot for him to process, you know. Losing his mother so young, having to accept another woman into his father's life. She threw the words around like subtle slaps, each one laden with falsehood. But Liam saw what no one else saw. He knew what was hidden behind that smile. No, that's not it, Liam shouted, his voice now desperate. She's lying, Dad. I saw the insurance. I saw the pictures of her with that man. They're going to hurt you. Please, you have to believe me. David looked at Liam, and for a moment it seemed as if he wanted to believe him. He really did. But how could he believe such a story? How could he accept that the woman he was about to marry was plotting his death? How could he look at his son, whom he loved more than anything, and believe such a devastating accusation? Emily, what's going on? David asked again, his voice now weak, almost begging for an answer that would make it all go away. But Emily was no fool. She knew the situation was slipping out of her hands, and her expression changed again. The smile disappeared, and her eyes turned cold, calculating. David, she began, now with frightening calm, don't be ridiculous. Are you really going to let an 8-year-old boy destroy what we have? He's jealous. That's natural. But he'll get over it. You know that. Silence overtook the church again. Everyone was in shock, not knowing what to think. And at that moment, David finally saw what Liam had been trying to show him all along. Something inside him broke. He looked at Emily with eyes full of pain, and at his son, who stood there, fragile but firm. I can't go on with this, David muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The silence after David's speech was deafening. No one moved. No one knew what to do. Liam looked at his father, his heart racing, hoping that he would finally understand. David stood still, taking a deep breath, looking at Emily as if he were seeing her for the first time, his eyes full of confusion and pain. He wanted to believe that it was all a misunderstanding, but something inside him knew that his son wouldn't lie about something so serious. Emily, on the other hand, realized that control was slipping out of her hands. What she hadn't counted on was the courage of an 8-year-old boy. She had always thought that the fragile and frightened boy would remain silent. But there he was, exposing the whole truth in front of a packed church. And now, with all eyes fixed on her, the mask began to fall. His eyes lost their false sparkle, and a shadow of irritation took over his expression. David, don't be ridiculous, she said, trying to regain control, but her voice was different, charged with impatience. Are you really going to let a child's delusions ruin our marriage? Look at what he's saying. He's clearly confused, making up these absurd stories. She tried to keep her tone calm, but there was a hidden distress and urgency. David shook his head, as if trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense. Liam, are you absolutely sure of what you're saying? It's not your imagination? These are very serious accusations, son. The words came out with difficulty, as if David was struggling against reality, trying to find a reason not to believe them. Liam, already tired, shook his head affirmatively, tears in his eyes. I swear, Dad, I saw her. She was on the phone to a man, Mark. They were planning to hurt you, and I saw the life insurance documents. If you die, she gets all the money. I'm not lying. The whispering increased among the guests. The tension was palpable, and everyone was restless, exchanging suspicious glances. And that's when Emily exploded. Her patience, already exhausted, broke once and for all. Enough, she screamed, her eyes filled with hatred. I've had enough of this game. Are you going to believe this brat? Are you really going to throw everything away because of a spoiled child who can't accept that his father's moving on? The guests were shocked, not only by the aggressiveness of the words, but by Emily's transformation before their eyes. The sweet, gentle woman they had seen minutes before had completely disappeared, revealing someone much more dangerous, someone who was on the verge of losing control. The whole atmosphere changed, as if the air had become heavy and dense. David took a step back, his expression of disbelief and pain clear. He looked at Emily with wide eyes, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Emily, what have you done? His voice was barely more than a whisper. The despair was clear on Emily's face. She knew she had lost control of the situation. You don't understand, she snarled. I did this for us. I deserve this life. I deserve better than being trapped in a marriage with someone who can barely make ends meet. You would never have given me what I want. Hatred dripped from his voice and shock overtook those present. Liam felt tears welling up, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. Finally, his father was seeing the truth he had been trying to show him for months. David's face turned even paler, as if the gravity of the situation was falling on him like a sledgehammer. You were going to kill me, he said, more to himself, shock and sadness dominating his expression. You were really going to kill me? Emily, realizing that the situation was getting completely out of her control, turned around abruptly. Without a second thought, she began to run, pushing past the guests to make her way to the church exit. Everyone was paralyzed for a second, too shocked to react, until someone shouted, "Stop her!" Chaos overtook the place. Some guests ran after Emily, but she was fast. She ran out of the church doors and disappeared down the street. David stood still in shock as the people around him tried to understand what had just happened. The chaos inside the church did not subside. The voices, once low and full of expectation, now turned into loud murmurs, full of confusion and shock. Liam stood motionless, breathing fast, trying to process everything that had just happened. Emily had run away, and he knew it wasn't over yet. But what mattered at that moment was the look on his father's face. David couldn't take his eyes off Liam. He was finally seeing the truth, a truth that had been in front of him all along, but which he had refused to see. And that truth hit him like a painful blow to the chest. The woman he loved, the woman he thought was the salvation for his lonely life, was actually trying to destroy him. He had been deceived, manipulated, and his own son, the one he was supposed to protect, was the one who saved him. Without saying anything, David approached Liam, his eyes full of tears that he was trying to hold back. He knelt down to the boy, and before he could say a word, Liam threw himself into his arms, the sobs coming hard. It was as if all the tension, fear, and despair of the last few months had come crashing down at once. David hugged his son tightly, as if to make up for all the times he hadn't listened to him, all the signs he had ignored. I'm so sorry, David whispered, his voice hoarse, flawed. I should have listened to you, son. I should have seen. Forgive me. The words came out with difficulty, shame, and regret present in every syllable. Liam, between sobs, mumbled, I just wanted you to be okay, Dad. I just wanted to save you. The pain in David's chest was overwhelming. How had he not noticed? How had he let his son suffer so much, carry this enormous weight all by himself? He had no excuses. He only had guilt. You saved me, Liam. You were brave, much braver than I ever was. I love you so much, son, more than you can imagine. As the two of them stood there, embracing in the middle of the church, the noise around them seemed to disappear for a moment. The world was falling apart around them. But in that instant, all that mattered was that they were together, and that David finally saw the truth. He held his son tighter, feeling the warmth of the little body trembling in his arms. The sound of sirens outside brought David back to reality. The police arrived quickly, and the news that Emily was on the run soon spread among the guests. One of the policemen approached David and Liam, interrupting that moment of fragile peace. Mr. Matthews, we need you and your son to come to the police station to give a statement. We're going to find this woman as soon as possible. David nodded slowly, still holding Liam. He knew that this nightmare wasn't over, that the woman he thought he knew was on the run, and that they couldn't rest until she was found. But there was something that reassured him now. He wasn't alone. He had his son, and together they would face whatever came their way. As they were escorted to the car, David looked around, seeing the looks on the faces of the guests, all stunned, some trying to understand what had just happened, others still in disbelief at the turn the wedding had taken. All he wanted at that moment was for it to be just a bad dream. But it wasn't. Inside the police car, David held Liam's hand tightly. He knew that the journey to the police station would be long and that many questions were still to come. But the worst was over. The danger was out there. But they were together. And that in itself was a victory. It's going to be okay, son, David said softly, trying to comfort himself more than the boy. We'll come out of this. Together. Liam, his head resting on his father's shoulder, just nodded, feeling real relief for the first time in months. It wasn't the end of the nightmare, but now he knew that, no matter what happened, he was no longer alone in this fight. The police car pulled away from the church, taking father and son into a new phase of their lives. As the police car drove away, Liam looked out of the window, watching the church disappear into the distance. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but there was something different now. The weight he had been carrying for months seemed to have eased a little. He no longer had to fight alone. His father finally believed in him. David, sitting next to Liam, held his son's hand tightly. The pain and guilt were still there, but there was also a feeling of gratitude. Liam had been incredibly brave. He had saved his father's life, even when no one believed him. David looked at his son, who was now resting his head on his shoulder, and promised himself that he would never let anything like this happen again. He had failed to protect his son before, but now they were together. Arriving at the police station, the process was slow. Liam had to tell them everything he knew, detail the conversations he had overheard, the evidence he had found on Emily's computer. The officers listened attentively, taking notes while David stayed by his son's side, his hand on his shoulder, as a silent but essential support. We're going to do everything we can to find her, said one of the officers as he put the documents away. With the information you've given us, we already have a solid line of inquiry. She won't be getting away for long. David nodded but knew that the road would still be long. Emily, or whatever her real name was, had disappeared, and until she was found, her shadow would still hang over them. But now there was hope. They knew the truth. Back home, the stillness of the place was almost comforting. Everything was calm, but also charged with a sense of new beginnings. David knew that somehow things would never be the same again. He had almost lost everything. But there, sitting on the sofa next to Liam, he realized that the most important thing was by his side, his son's love and courage. It's going to be all right, son, he repeated, now with more conviction, as he looked at the boy. Liam, calmer, just nodded. For the first time, he felt that his father was truly with him. And so, as night fell, father and son sat in silence, enjoying that rare moment of peace. They didn't know what the future would bring, but together they felt ready to face anything.